The knock came at 3 a.m, insistent but not urgent, the kind of knock that suggested business rather than emergency. Thomas Wright pulled his coat over his nightshirt and descended the narrow stairs of his Clerkenwell establishment, his breath visible in the October cold of 1807. London at this hour was a city of fog and silence, gaslight struggling against the darkness, the streets emptied of all but those whose work belonged to the night. He opened the door to find a well-dressed gentleman standing on the threshold, hat in hand, his face showing neither grief nor distress, only the calm expectation of someone accustomed to having his needs met regardless of the hour. "Mr. Wright, I understand you're the man to see about a delicate matter." Thomas nodded. He had been expecting this call, or one like it. His reputation had spread through certain circles, whispered in drawing rooms and clubs, passed along by those who needed services that conventional undertakers would not provide. He was known for his discretion, for his skill, and most importantly, for his willingness to ask no questions when questions would be inconvenient. "There has been an unfortunate incident," the gentleman continued, his voice low. "At a house in Mayfair, a young woman. The family wishes to avoid complications." Thomas understood immediately. Not a natural death, then. Not something that could be reported to the authorities without consequences for people who could not afford consequences. The young woman would have a different name in the morning, a different story, a different place of death. She would be transformed through paperwork and careful arrangement into someone whose demise raised no eyebrows, generated no investigation, disappeared into the vast anonymity of London's daily mortality. "I can be there within the hour," Thomas said. "My usual fee, plus expenses for the arrangements." The gentleman nodded, producing a leather purse heavy with coins. "Discretion is essential. The family is prominent. Any scandal would be unacceptable." Thomas pocketed the purse without counting it. He had learned long ago that men who paid well for silence expected that silence to be absolute, and that violating that expectation was not merely bad business, but genuinely dangerous. He had also learned that Victorian London generated more such deaths than anyone cared to acknowledge, that behind the respectable facades of the greatest city in the world, people did in ways that required explanation, revision, erasure. He was not a murderer, he killed no one, but he cleaned up after those who did, and after those whose carelessness or cruelty or simple bad luck had resulted in deaths that needed to be managed rather than mourned. He was the corpse collector, the man who made problems disappear, who transformed scandal into routine mortality, who understood that in a city of 5 million people, death was so common that no one looked too closely at one more body, if the paperwork was in order and the story was plausible. He gathered his tools, his cart, his certificates and forms. He called for his assistant, a silent man named Webb, who had worked for him for 7 years and who had never once asked a question about the bodies they collected in the hours when decent people slept. They set out into the fog, moving through streets that belonged to a different London than the one tourists saw, the London of servants' entrances and backstairs and transactions conducted in darkness, where the machinery that kept Victorian society functioning ground on without acknowledgement or gratitude. The house in Mayfair was dark except for a single light in a downstairs window. The gentleman met them at the service entrance, led them through corridors to a room where a young woman lay on a settee, her face peaceful, her body arranged to suggest sleep rather than death. Thomas examined her briefly, professionally. Poison, almost certainly, though whether administered deliberately or accidentally, he could not determine and did not care to speculate. His job was not to investigate, but to transform, to take this inconvenient corpse and make it into something manageable, something that would not destroy the family whose name would never be spoken aloud in connection with this night. "She will be Sarah Miller," Thomas said, already constructing the story. "A seamstress, lodging in Whitechapel. Died of consumption at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. I have the forms. No one will question it." The gentleman nodded, relief visible in his posture. "The family is grateful, Mr. Wright, and they trust your discretion will be permanent." "It always is," Thomas replied, already beginning the work of transformation, the careful process that would erase this woman's real identity and replace it with one that raised no questions, that fit comfortably into the vast machinery of London mortality, that would allow her to be buried in a pauper's grave with no one ever knowing who she really was or how she really died. This was his craft. This was his business. And in Victorian London, business was very, very good. Chapter 1. The Undertaker's Trade. Good evening and welcome back to the Bedside Historian. The night has settled around you now, I hope. Wherever you find yourself listening, beneath warm blankets or in a quiet corner of your home, I trust you are comfortable, safe, ready to drift backward and through time to an era when death was not hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes, but was instead woven into the fabric of daily life, visible, unavoidable, and for some, extremely profitable. Before we begin our journey into Victorian London's darker trades, if you haven't yet subscribed to this channel, I invite you to do so. These stories require careful research, thoughtful construction, and time spent in archives pulling forgotten lives from dusty records. Your support allows this work to continue. Now then, where are you listening from? Tonight? What hour finds you? Is it late where you are, the world outside gone silent? Or perhaps you're in that liminal space between day and night when shadows grow long and the boundary between past and present feels somehow thinner? Wherever you are, whatever the hour, settle in. Let the modern world fade, and let us travel together to London in the 1860s, to a city where death was industry, where grief was commerce, and where certain men made their fortunes by making problems disappear. Let us begin with the Undertakers. The year is 1807. Death in Victorian London was omnipresent in ways that are difficult for modern minds to fully comprehend. The city's population had exploded from approximately 1 million in 1800 to over 3 million by the 1860s, a growth so rapid that infrastructure struggled to accommodate the living, let alone manage the dead. In poorer neighbourhoods, entire families lived in single rooms. Cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, and countless other diseases moved through the population in waves. Infant mortality was staggering, with nearly half of all children failing to reach their 5th birthday. Death touched every household, every street, every day. The undertaking trade had evolved to meet this constant demand, developing into a complex hierarchy of establishments that served different segments of society with varying degrees of dignity and expense. At the top were the fashionable West End firms, establishments with shopfronts displaying elaborate caskets and mourning attire, with offices where grieving families could meet with undertakers who spoke in hushed, respectful tones about arrangements and expenses. These firms served the wealthy, the aristocracy, the merchant class, people for whom a funeral was not merely a disposal of remains but a social performance, a demonstration of status, grief, and respectability, all choreographed according to precise Victorian conventions. A proper middle-class funeral in the 1860s was an expensive affair, potentially costing several months' wages for a working family. The deceased would be laid out in the home for viewing, the house decorated with black crape and mourning wreaths. Professional mourners might be hired to walk in the procession. A hearse drawn by black horses with black plumes would carry the casket. The undertaker would provide everything necessary for this performance, from the casket itself to the mourning cards to the refreshments served after the burial. These respectable firms maintained appearances of solemn dignity, presenting themselves as servants of grief rather than merchants of death, though they were very much the latter, marking up every item significantly because grieving families were in no position to negotiate and social pressure demanded they spend appropriately or face judgment for insufficient mourning. Below the respectable establishments were the working-class undertakers, smaller operations that served neighbourhoods rather than wealthy, clients that offered simpler funerals at prices labourers could afford, though even these were often ruinously expensive for families already living at the edge of poverty. These undertakers operated from modest premises, sometimes from their own homes, and provided basic services: a simple coffin, a cart rather than a hearse, burial in a common grave rather than a private plot. They made their living through volume rather than luxury, handling dozens of funerals weekly, moving bodies through the system with efficiency rather than ceremony. And below these, at the bottom of the hierarchy, were the paupers undertakers, men who contracted with parishes and workhouses to dispose of the bodies of those who died with nothing, whose families could not afford even the simplest funeral, who would be buried in mass graves with dozens of others, their coffins often little more than rough boxes that were sometimes reused, bodies dumped directly into the earth once the grave was reached. These undertakers made minimal profit per body but handled enormous volume, their carts making daily rounds to collect the dead from hospitals, workhouses, poorhouses, and the streets themselves. Thomas Wright occupied a unique position in this hierarchy. His establishment in Clerkenwell was respectable in appearance, neither grand nor squalid, presenting itself as a modest but professional operation serving middle-class clients. He handled conventional funerals, the ordinary business of death, with competence and appropriate solemnity. But this legitimate work was merely his public face, the respectable front behind which his actual specialty operated. Thomas Wright was known, among those who needed to know, as the man to contact when a death required not just burial but management, when circumstances surrounding a demise were inconvenient or scandalous or criminal, when a body needed to disappear not from the physical world, but from the official record of how and why and where death had occurred. He had developed this specialty gradually, almost accidentally, early in his career. A gentleman had approached him about handling the funeral of a servant girl who had died in his household, who had no family to claim her, whose death certificate indicated consumption, but whose actual cause of death had been rather different. The gentleman had been willing to pay significantly above the usual rate for discretion, for ensuring that the burial occurred quietly, that no questions were asked, that the girl's name and the household where she had died remained unconnected in any official record. Thomas had handled the matter efficiently, asking no questions, and had discovered that there was considerable demand for such services among London's respectable classes. The arrangement had advantages for everyone involved. The families avoided scandal that could ruin reputations, end political careers, destroy marriage prospects for daughters, or simply generate the kind of gossip that made life in society circles unbearable. Thomas made significantly more money per case than he would handling conventional funerals, and the deceased, who had no say in the matter, were buried under names and circumstances that bore little resemblance to their actual identities or the actual manner of their deaths, but who were at least buried, which was more than some undertakers in his position could promise. Over the years, Thomas had refined his methods, developed his network, earned which doctors could be persuaded to sign certificates with creatively interpreted causes of death, which cemetery clerks would accept bodies with minimal documentation, which coroners could be convinced that an inquest was unnecessary. He had built a reputation for reliability and absolute discretion. He never gossiped. He never blackmailed clients, though he possessed information that could have destroyed dozens of prominent families. He simply provided a service, collected his fee, and moved on to the next case. It was a business model that worked remarkably well in a city where appearances mattered more than truth, and where the machinery of death certification and burial was sufficiently disorganized that a clever operator could exploit its gaps almost indefinitely. The Victorian obsession with death rituals paradoxically made this kind of manipulation easier rather than harder. Society demanded elaborate mourning, prescribed grief, performance of loss according to strict conventions, but this focus on the external trappings of death meant that the actual circumstances of death received less scrutiny than might otherwise have been the case. If the funeral was properly solemn, if the mourning dress was correctly black, if the appropriate period of withdrawal from society was observed, then the family had done their duty. The details of how the deceased had actually died became secondary to the performance of mourning properly executed. Death certificates in the 1860s were remarkable for their lack of rigour. A doctor's signature was required, but doctors varied enormously in their diligence and ethics. Some were scrupulous, examining bodies carefully, recording accurate causes of death. Others were careless or corrupt, signing certificates based on cursory examination or on information provided by family members, accepting payment to record causes of death that avoided scandal or legal complications. There was no central oversight, no system for verifying that the causes of death recorded on certificates matched the actual medical facts. A certificate signed by a qualified physician was generally accepted without question, even when the circumstances might have warranted investigation. Thomas had cultivated relationships with several doctors who understood the value of flexibility in death certification. These were not necessarily dishonest men in the conventional sense. Many genuinely believed they were performing a service by sparing families additional grief during already difficult times. Others rationalized that the dead were beyond help and that protecting the living took precedence over strict adherence to accuracy. And some, it must be acknowledged, simply appreciated the extra income that came from signing certificates that required creative interpretation of medical evidence. Thomas paid well, recommended these doctors to other clients, and ensured they understood that their cooperation would remain confidential. The actual process of managing an inconvenient death typically began with the late-night knock, the discreet summons from a household where something had gone wrong. Thomas would arrive with his assistant Webb, a man whose silence was as valuable as his strength and whose ability to lift and carry bodies without flinching had made him indispensable. They would be admitted through servants' entrances, led to wherever the body lay, and given a brief explanation of circumstances, though often the explanation was vague, designed to give them enough information to construct a plausible alternative narrative without burdening them with details that might prove dangerous to know. Thomas would more examine the body, not with the thoroughness of a physician, but with the practiced eye of someone who had seen hundreds of corpses in various states and conditions. He assessed what story the body could plausibly tell. A young woman dead from poison might become a seamstress dead from consumption. A man with his throat cut might become a clerk who had suffered an apoplectic fit. A baby with marks suggesting violence might become a stillbirth. The transformations required understanding not just what people died from, but what deaths were common enough and tragic enough to generate sympathy rather than suspicion. The body would be removed to Thomas's premises, transported in his covered cart through the pre-dawn streets when few people were abroad to notice or question. At his establishment, in a room that was kept cold and clean and that few people beyond Thomas and Webb ever entered, the transformation would be completed. Clothing would be changed if necessary, removing garments that were too fine or too specific to the deceased's actual social position and replacing them with clothing appropriate to whatever identity Thomas was constructing. Any obvious marks or injuries that contradicted the official cause of death would be concealed through careful arrangement or, if necessary, through judicious application of cosmetics and techniques Thomas had learned from observing theatrical makeup artists. The death certificate would be obtained, signed by one of Thomas's cooperative doctors, recording a name that might or might not be the deceased's actual name and a cause of death that was plausible if not accurate. The certificate would be registered with the appropriate authorities, a process that in the 1860s was remarkably casual, with clerks who processed dozens of certificates daily and who rarely questioned submissions that appeared properly completed. The body would be prepared for burial, placed in a coffin appropriate to the deceased's supposed social position, and transported to one of London's sprawling cemeteries for interment in a grave that would bear a marker with the false name or, more commonly, no marker at all. From initial contact to final burial, the entire process typically took 3 to 5 days, during which time the actual circumstances of death would be obscured beyond recovery, the deceased's real identity erased or hidden, the scandal averted. The family who had sought Thomas's services would return to their normal lives, their reputation intact, their secret buried literally and figuratively. And Thomas Wright would add another case to the mental catalogue of deaths he had managed, another name to the list he kept nowhere but in his own memory, another contribution to the hidden history of Victorian London that existed in parallel to the official record. It was a grim business, morally ambiguous at best, actively facilitating injustice at worst. Thomas was not naive about the implications of his work. He understood that some of the deaths he concealed were murders, that by transforming them into natural deaths or accidents he was allowing killers to escape justice. He understood that many of his clients were protecting themselves rather than the deceased, that their concern was reputation rather than respect for the dead. He understood that he was profiting from tragedy and from the desperation of people who had something to hide. But he also understood, with the clear-eyed pragmatism of someone who had grown up poor and had clawed his way to modest prosperity, that Victorian London was built on lies and concealment, that respectable society maintained its facade through constant management of inconvenient truths, and that if he did not provide this service, someone else would. He told himself that he made problems smaller rather than creating them, that the deaths would have occurred regardless of his involvement, that his role was clean-up rather than cause. Whether these rationalizations allowed him to sleep at night was a question he rarely examined and never answered honestly, even to himself. By 1807, Thomas Wright had been operating his dual business for nearly 15 years, managing perhaps 1 or 2 discrete cases monthly, alongside his conventional undertaking work. He had accumulated modest wealth, enough to live comfortably, to maintain a respectable household, to present himself as a successful tradesman. He had also accumulated secrets, hundreds of them, an entire catalogue of death and concealment that existed only in his memory and in the scattered false records that dotted London's official mortality documentation. He was 43 years old, healthy, professionally successful, and beginning to realise that the business he had built was also a trap from which there might be no escape, because the secrets he carried were valuable and dangerous in equal measure, and the people who had paid for his discretion might eventually decide that the only guarantee of permanent silence was his own death. But that realisation lay ahead. In the autumn of 1807, business was good, his reputation secure, and the knock at the door that opened this chapter read was simply another case, another problem to be solved, another body to be collected and transformed and buried under a name that was not quite right and a story that was not quite true. The corpse collector's work continued, as it had for years, as it would for a while longer, in the shadows and margins of Victorian London, where death was commerce and truth was negotiable, and men like Thomas Wright made their living by making the inconvenient disappear. Chapter 2. The City of Death. London in the 1860s was the largest city on earth, the centre of an empire that spanned continents, a metropolis of unprecedented wealth and power and innovation, and simultaneously a place where death was so commonplace that it barely registered as remarkable unless it occurred in unusual circumstances or to unusual people. The city's growth had been extraordinary and chaotic. Rural migrants flooded in from across Britain, seeking work in factories and docks and railways. Irish refugees arrived by the thousands after the famine, desperate and destitute. The population density in some neighbourhoods exceeded anything that had been seen before in human history, with tenements housing families in single rooms, with courts, stalls and alleys where buildings pressed so close together that sunlight never reached the ground, where ventilation was non-existent and sanitation was primitive or entirely absent. The infrastructure that had served a city of 1 million could not accommodate 3 million without catastrophic strain. The water supply was inadequate and frequently contaminated. The sewage system, despite the engineering marvel of the new sewers being constructed, still failed to reach many neighbourhoods where waste accumulated in cesspits and flowed through open gutters. The air itself was toxic, choked with coal smoke from hundreds of thousands of fires, with industrial emissions, with the constant fog that Londoners called pea soupers, thick yellow-grey blankets that reduced visibility to feet and that carried particles of soot and sulphur deep into lungs. Disease thrived in these conditions. Cholera epidemics swept through the city periodically, killing thousands in weeks, the disease spreading through contaminated water before doctors fully understood how it transmitted. Typhoid and typhus were endemic, particularly in the poorest neighbourhoods where overcrowding and poor sanitation created ideal conditions for the bacteria that caused them. Tuberculosis, called consumption, killed slowly and democratically, affecting rich and poor alike, though the poor died from it in far greater numbers because their living conditions weakened their bodies and because they had no access to the rest and nutrition that might slow the disease's progression. Infant mortality was perhaps the most devastating aspect of London's death toll. Babies died from diarrheal diseases, from respiratory infections, from simple failure to thrive in environments where mothers were malnourished and exhausted, where clean water and milk were difficult to obtain, where medical care was unaffordable. The working-class practice of baby farming, where infants were given to women who promised to care for them in exchange for payment, resulted in countless deaths from neglect or deliberate starvation. Babies disposed of when they became inconvenient, their deaths recorded as natural if they were recorded at all. The tiny coffins were a common sight on the streets, children's funerals so frequent that they generated little comment beyond the immediate family. The sheer volume of death created an entire economy around its management. Beyond the undertakers were the grave diggers, men who worked in the cemeteries excavating graves, often in soil that was already saturated with decomposing bodies from previous burials. The sexton managed the church burial grounds, keeping records, collecting fees, overseeing the constant cycle of interment in spaces that were running out of room. The bone collectors gathered skeletal remains from overcrowded burial grounds to make space for fresh bodies, selling the bones to be ground into fertilizer or used in industrial processes. The mourning dressmakers and sellers of black crepe and memorial cards and jet jewellery all profited from society's elaborate rituals of grief. The cemeteries themselves were overwhelmed. The old church burial grounds in central London had been closed to new burials by the 1850s, their soil literally saturated with human remains, bodies buried in layers, coffins stacked vertically, the earth unable to accommodate more decomposition. The great cemetery companies had been established to address this crisis, creating vast burial grounds on London's outskirts: Kensal Green, Highgate, Abney Park, Brompton, Nunhead, Tower Hamlets, West Norwood. These were designed as garden cemeteries, with landscaping and monuments and sections for different classes and denominations, commercializing death on an industrial scale. But even these massive cemeteries struggled to keep pace with demand. Common graves, large pits where multiple unrelated bodies were buried together, were filled and covered over, and then reopened after a few years when the bodies had decomposed sufficiently to make room for more. Private graves required ongoing payment of maintenance fees, and when families could no longer afford them, or simply lost track of them over generations, the plots were reclaimed and reused. The management of burial space was a constant negotiation between respect for the dead and the practical reality that the dead accumulated faster than space could be allocated. The poorest Londoners faced the indignity of burial in ways that reflected their marginal status in life. Those who died in workhouses, in prisons, in hospitals for the indigent were buried at parish expense in mass graves with minimal ceremony. The bodies would be collected weekly, loaded onto carts, transported to cemeteries, and interred efficiently and cheaply. If family members wanted to visit the grave, they often could not determine exactly where their loved one lay because individual burial locations within the common graves were not recorded. The dead simply disappeared into the earth, their final resting place as anonymous as their lives had been precarious. This system created numerous opportunities for manipulation and fraud. Bodies could be misidentified easily when they arrived at cemeteries from hospitals or workhouses, particularly when decomposition had begun or when clothing had been removed. A body that arrived with paperwork identifying it as John Smith from Whitechapel might actually be James Brown from Mayfair. The switch made somewhere between death and burial, the original John Smith having been disposed of through other means, while James Brown's family used Thomas Wright's services to provide their son with a pauper's burial under a false name, avoiding the scandal that James's actual death circumstances would have generated. The Resurrection Men, though their heyday had passed by the 1860s, had established precedents for the commodification of bodies that influenced how the dead were viewed and managed. These were the men who had dug up fresh corpses to sell to medical schools for anatomical study, operating illegally but meeting genuine demand from physicians who needed cadavers for training and research. The Anatomy Act of 1832 had largely eliminated the resurrection trade by legalizing the use of unclaimed bodies from workhouses and hospitals, but the legacy remained. A cultural understanding that bodies without families to protect them were resources to be utilized rather than persons to be respected. The medical profession itself contributed to the infrastructure of death in ways both legitimate and problematic. Doctors certified causes of death, but their knowledge varied enormously, and in an era before most diseases were well understood, before bacteria and viruses had been discovered, causes of death were often guesswork based on visible symptoms. Someone who died vomiting blood might be certified as dying from hemorrhage, from consumption, from gastric fever, from any number of conditions that produced similar symptoms. The flexibility in diagnosis created space for deliberate falsification, particularly when doctors were motivated by payment or by sympathy for families seeking to avoid scandal. Coroners conducted inquests when deaths appeared suspicious or occurred in certain circumstances, such as accidents or suicides, but the system was inconsistent and under-resourced. A coroner's jury, composed of local men with no medical training, would hear testimony from doctors and witnesses and deliver a verdict on cause of death. These verdicts could be surprisingly creative, recording obvious suicides as accidental deaths to spare families, the additional shame and legal complications that came with the suicide verdict, declaring murders to be accidents when evidence was ambiguous or when no one could be identified as responsible, finding causes of death that satisfied social and legal requirements while bearing little relationship to medical reality. The police, established only decades earlier as London's first professional law enforcement, were primarily concerned with preventing disorder and recovering stolen property rather than investigating deaths. Unless a murder was obvious and public, unless there was clear evidence of foul play and a suspect who could be readily identified, the police generally deferred to coroners and doctors to determine cause of death and took no further action. The resources simply did not exist for investigating every suspicious death in a city where thousands of people died weekly, where the distinction between natural death and neglect or deliberate harm was often impossible to establish with certainty. This entire system, the volume of death, the infrastructure overwhelmed, the looseness of certification and verification, the class divisions that determined how bodies were treated, the economic incentives that ran through every aspect of death management, created an environment where men like Thomas Wright could operate with relative impunity. The authorities were not actively complicit in concealing deaths, but their capacity to detect concealment was severely limited by resources, by technology, by the sheer scale of mortality they were managing, and by social assumptions that deaths occurring in certain contexts or to certain people required less scrutiny than others. A servant girl dying in a wealthy household would not receive the same investigative attention as a wealthy merchant dying in suspicious circumstances, because servants died frequently, and their deaths were not considered socially significant. A baby dying in infancy was tragic but utterly commonplace, expected even, and unless there was obvious evidence of violence, the death would be recorded as natural and the body buried without investigation. A prostitute found dead in an alley might not be investigated at all, might be buried as a Jane Doe in a common grave with no effort made to determine who she was or how she had died, because prostitutes were disposable in the eyes of authority, their lives mattering so little that their deaths warranted minimal attention. Thomas Wright understood this landscape intimately. He had learned through experience which deaths could be easily obscured and which could not, which clients could be served and which were too risky, which circumstances allowed for falsification and which required genuine disposal of evidence. He operated within gaps in the system, exploiting weaknesses that existed not because of individual corruption, but because of structural inadequacies that made comprehensive oversight impossible. The city of death was also a city of life, of course, of commerce and culture and progress. The Thames was crowded with ships from around the world. The railways carried passengers and goods at speeds that had been unimaginable a generation earlier. The gaslight that illuminated streets after dark represented technological advancement that made the city safer and more navigable than it had ever been. The great projects of Victorian London, the sewers, the underground railway, the museums and parks and institutions demonstrated ambition and capability that seemed to promise unlimited improvement. But beneath this progress, literally and figuratively, the dead accumulated. They lay in the cemeteries in numbers that staggered imagination. They were built into the fabric of the city itself, bones discovered whenever construction occurred, whenever basements were excavated, whenever the earth was disturbed. They existed in records and in memory, and in the blank spaces where records should have been but were not, where deaths had occurred but had been managed out of official existence by men who understood that in a city of death, one more body could disappear without trace if handled correctly. Thomas Wright's business depended on this reality. His clients came to him because they understood, consciously or not, that London's system for managing death was sufficiently porous that inconvenient deaths could be made convenient with the right assistance. They paid him to navigate this system, to transform scandal into routine mortality, to ensure that their family member's death became just one more statistic in a city that produced statistics of death in overwhelming abundance. And the city, indifferent to individual tragedy, absorbed these falsifications without noticing, without caring. The machinery of death, management grinding on as it always had, processing bodies through burial with efficiency if not dignity, maintaining just enough order to prevent complete collapse while allowing enough chaos that those who knew how could exploit it profitably. Chapter 3. The Discretion Business. The clients came from every level of respectable society, united not by social class but by their need for problems to disappear, for deaths to be managed rather than reported, for scandal to be averted through careful intervention and absolute discretion. Thomas Wright maintained a small office at the front of his Clerkenwell establishment, a room decorated with the sombre dignity expected of an undertaker. Dark wood furnishings, heavy curtains, a few tasteful prints on the walls depicting angels or peaceful cemetery scenes. This was where he met clients who sought conventional funeral services, where bereaved families made arrangements that were straightforward and unremarkable. But there was another office, a smaller room accessible through a side door on a quiet street, where different sorts of meetings occurred after dark, where clients arrived without appointments but with urgent need and heavy purses. The aristocracy came rarely, but when they did, the fees were extraordinary and the complications significant. A titled family whose son had died in circumstances that could ruin the family name if made public. A lord whose mistress had succumbed to a failed abortion and whose body needed to disappear before questions could be asked. A lady of quality whose infant had been stillborn or had died shortly after birth in ways that suggested neglect or something worse, who could not bear the social scrutiny that an honest death certificate would generate. These clients expected perfection, demanded guarantees that Thomas could not actually provide, and paid sums that made the risk almost worthwhile. One such case had occurred in the winter of 1865, when a duke's youngest son had died at a gentleman's club following a night of excessive drinking and activities that the family would never acknowledge. The young man had been 23 years old, handsome, charming, and reckless in ways that his family had indulged until the recklessness proved fatal. He had collapsed in a private room at the club, surrounded by friends who had panicked, who had summoned the club's manager, who had sent for Thomas Wright rather than for a doctor or the police because Thomas's reputation had reached even these elevated circles. Thomas had arrived to find a scene of chaos barely contained. Young men of quality standing around a body on the floor, their evening clothes dishevelled, their faces showing fear that was perhaps the first genuine emotion some of them had felt in their pampered lives. The young duke's son was obviously dead, his face congested, his lips blue, his body already cooling. The room smelled of alcohol and vomit and something else, something sweet and chemical that Thomas recognized immediately as chloroform, a substance that was used medically, but that had become popular among certain social circles for recreational purposes, usually inhaled from handkerchiefs for the euphoric sensation it produced before unconsciousness. The young man had died from asphyxiation, most likely, having inhaled too much chloroform while intoxicated, his respiratory system depressed by the combination until it simply stopped functioning. It was a death that was utterly avoidable, that resulted from privilege and boredom and the conviction that consequences applied to other people, not to the sons of dukes. And it was a death that could destroy the family if the circumstances became public, could end the duke's political career, could affect the marriage prospects of the young man's sisters, could reduce the family from respected nobility to objects of scandal and mockery. Thomas had assessed the situation. Quickly, the body could not remain at the club, the other young men needed to leave immediately, to establish that they had been elsewhere when the death occurred, to create alibis that would hold if questions were asked. The club's manager needed to forget this entire incident, which would require both payment and assurance that discretion would be rewarded while indiscretion would have consequences. And the body needed a new identity, a new location of death, a cause of death that was tragic but respectable. The young duke's son had become, in Thomas's reconstruction, a clerk named Edward Thompson, who had died of heart failure while walking through Regent's Park. A doctor Thomas knew had been willing to sign the certificate after examining the body, had accepted Thomas's description of symptoms and circumstances, had recorded natural causes despite the chemical smell that still clung faintly to the dead man's clothing. The body had been dressed in clothes appropriate to a clerk, had been transported to a modest lodging house whose landlady Thomas had used before for such purposes, and had been discovered the following morning as though death had occurred during the night. The funeral had been simple, attended by no one, the burial in a common section of Kensal Green Cemetery under the name Edward Thompson, with no marker to indicate who lay beneath the earth. The Duke had paid Thomas £500 for the service, more money than Thomas typically made in a year from conventional undertaking. And the young man's death had been noted in the Times as a tragic loss, with the family receiving appropriate condolences, with no mention of clubs or chloroform or the sordid reality of how a privileged life had ended. But the aristocracy, while lucrative, represented only a small portion of Thomas's discretion business. More commonly, his clients were from the merchant and professional classes, people of comfortable means who were not quite wealthy enough to be invulnerable to scandal, but who had enough money to pay for problems to be managed quietly. These were the doctors whose female patients died from botched abortions, the solicitors whose embezzlement had driven business partners to suicide, the factory owners whose unsafe premises had killed workers in ways that might generate liability if properly investigated. One recurring category of client involved illegitimate children, babies born to women who could not acknowledge them, whose existence threatened reputations or marriages or inheritances. Some of these infants died naturally, victims of the high mortality rates that affected all babies, but that were worse for children whose mothers were stressed and undernourished and unable to access medical care. Others died from neglect, from being given to baby farmers who had no intention of actually caring for the children, who collected the payment and then allowed the babies to starve or administered opiates until the infant simply failed to wake. And some died from deliberate violence, smothered or drowned or abandoned in places where death was inevitable. Thomas tried not to think too carefully about which category applied to the tiny bodies that occasionally came to him wrapped in blankets or placed in carpet bags, delivered by pale-faced women or grim-faced men who paid in cash and who disappeared immediately after the transaction. His role was not to investigate or to judge, but simply to ensure that the bodies were buried with certificates that recorded stillbirth or natural infant death, that no questions were asked about identity or parentage, that the problem was resolved with finality. The servants were another category, a large one, representing the vulnerability of those who worked in the homes of their social betters and who sometimes witnessed or experienced or simply knew too much. A maid who had been made pregnant by her employer's son and who died during an abortion arranged to conceal the pregnancy. A footman who discovered his master's financial frauds and who suffered a convenient accident shortly thereafter. A cook who had been present when a suspicious death occurred in the household and who was found dead of what was recorded as natural causes, but what Thomas suspected was poisoning. These deaths were the most troubling because they so clearly represented the disposal of inconvenient people, the silencing of witnesses, the elimination of those whose testimony might threaten their employers. Thomas told himself he was not causing these deaths, merely cleaning up after them, but the distinction felt increasingly hollow as the years passed and the bodies accumulated. He was facilitating injustice, allowing murderers to escape consequences, participating in a system that treated working-class lives as disposable when they became inconvenient to those with wealth and power. But he continued, because the money was good, because he had become skilled at the work, because saying no to one client might mean all clients would eventually hear of his refusal and his business would evaporate, leaving him with only conventional undertaking which barely paid enough to maintain his establishment and his household. The discretion business was lucrative, but it was also a trap, each case binding him more tightly to a network of clients who expected his continued service and whose secrets he carried with him always. The mechanics of the discretion business required more than just falsifying death certificate and providing plausible alternative narratives. It required a network of cooperating individuals, each of whom needed to be compensated and managed, each of whom represented a potential vulnerability if they decided to talk or if circumstances made them careless. Thomas had cultivated these relationships carefully over years, understanding that his business depended on the reliability of people who were themselves operating outside legal and ethical boundaries. Dr. Edmund Blackwood was Thomas's primary physician, a man who had trained at respectable institutions but whose practice had declined due to drinking and gambling debts, who was now willing to sign certificates for cases he had never personally examined, who accepted Thomas's descriptions of symptoms and causes of death and translated them into medical language that appeared authoritative. Blackwood charged £5 per certificate, substantial money for a few minutes' work, and the arrangement had proved durable because both men understood they were mutually compromised. If Thomas were exposed, Blackwood's fraudulent certification would be revealed. If Blackwood were exposed, Thomas's entire operation would collapse. There were other doctors as well, men Thomas used when Blackwood was unavailable, or when the case required someone with better credentials or different specializations. All of them operated from similar motivations, financial need combined with rationalization that they were helping families avoid additional suffering, that the dead were beyond help anyway, that the lies they signed were merciful even if not truthful. Thomas maintained relationships with 4 such physicians, rotating between them to avoid any single doctor signing too many suspicious certificates, spreading the risk and the culpability across multiple participants. The cemetery clerks were crucial partners in the operation. These were the men who processed burial paperwork, who maintained records of who was buried where, who verified that death certificates matched the bodies being interred. Most clerks were honest and diligent, but every large cemetery had 1 or 2 whose attention could be purchased, who would accept bodies with minimal documentation, who would record burials under names that did not quite match the certificates, who would fail to notice when bodies arrived from locations that did not correspond to the registered place of death. Thomas paid these clerks modest but regular amounts, maintaining relationships that allowed him to use particular cemeteries for his discretion cases, without fear that discrepancies would be noted or reported. The lodging house keepers were another essential element. Thomas maintained relationships with several proprietors of cheap lodging houses in various neighbourhoods, people who would allow him to use their addresses as registered places of death, who would tell constables or coroners if asked that yes, a person of such and such description had been staying there and had died in the night, who understood they were participating in falsification, but who were compensated enough to overcome scruples and who asked no questions about the actual circumstances. Mrs. Headley in Whitechapel, Mr. Parsons in Southwark, the widow Jenkins in Bethnal Green, these were people Thomas had cultivated over years, whom he trusted because mutual dependence created more reliable bonds than friendship or principle. They received payment for each body that supposedly died at their establishments, and they provided cover stories that were simple and consistent. Working-class people who had taken in lodgers who had then died of common ailments in circumstances that generated no suspicion, because such deaths occurred regularly and legitimately in similar lodging houses throughout London. The assistant, Webb, was perhaps the most important element of all, because he was present for the actual handling of bodies, the transportation, the switching of clothing and identity, the physical work that Thomas could not accomplish alone. Webb had been with Thomas for 7 years, hired initially as a general labourer for the conventional undertaking business, but gradually brought into the discretion work as Thomas recognised his reliability and his incuriosity. Webb was a large man, strong enough to carry bodies easily, and he was also deeply taciturn, speaking rarely and never unnecessarily, following instructions without comment or question. Thomas paid Webb well, significantly above what he could earn elsewhere, understanding that Webb's silence was worth more than his labour. But Thomas also worried about Webb, about what the man thought, about whether the accumulation of secrets and lies and concealed deaths might eventually overwhelm whatever personal code kept Webb working without complaint. There was something in Webb's eyes sometimes, a look that Thomas could not quite interpret, that might have been judgment or might have been something else entirely, something darker that Thomas preferred not to examine too carefully. The entire network represented significant ongoing expense beyond the fees Thomas charged clients. The payments to doctors, to cemetery clerks, to lodging house keepers, to Webb, to others who provided occasional services or information or assistance, consumed perhaps half of what Thomas collected from the discretion business. But the remaining half was still substantial, enough that Thomas had accumulated savings that would allow him to retire comfortably if he chose, that gave him options that most men in his position would never have, except that retirement was not actually an option, because the secrets he carried could not be retired, because the clients who had paid for his discretion expected that discretion to continue indefinitely, because the network he had built could not simply be dismantled without risk, that someone in it would talk, would reveal what they knew, would bring down the entire structure and everyone in it. Thomas was trapped by his own success, bound to continue the discretion business, not because he wanted to, but because stopping seemed more dangerous than continuing. And so the bodies continued to arrive late at night, accompanied by desperate people with urgent problems and willingness to pay for solutions. And Thomas Wright continued to provide those solutions, transforming deaths from scandalous to routine, from complicated to simple, from truth to something close enough to truth that it would be accepted by a system that could not afford to look too closely at every death in a city where death was too common to merit careful attention unless circumstances made oversight unoptable. Chapter 4. The Paperwork Game. The entire enterprise of concealing death rested not on physical manipulation of bodies, which was relatively straightforward, but on the manipulation of documents, the creation of a paper trail that would satisfy bureaucratic requirements while bearing little relationship to reality, that would allow bodies to be buried under false names with false causes of death in ways that would never be detected unless someone had reason to examine the records with extraordinary diligence. Victorian bureaucracy, despite its reputation for precision and thoroughness, was remarkably easy to manipulate for someone who understood its structure and its weaknesses. The system for recording deaths involved multiple steps and multiple authorities, but these authorities rarely communicated effectively with each other, and the verification mechanisms that might have caught inconsistencies were either absent or so overburdened that they functioned only nominally. The process began with the death certificate itself, a document that required a physician's signature, but that was otherwise simply a form that anyone could obtain, that contained blank spaces for name, age, address, cause of death, and other particulars. The physician was supposed to examine the body, determine cause of death based on medical knowledge and observation, and sign the certificate attesting to the accuracy of the information recorded. But in practice, particularly in working-class neighbourhoods where people frequently could not afford doctors' services during life, let alone after death, certificates were often signed based on minimal examination or on information provided by family members, with the physician exercising varying degrees of scrutiny depending on their own ethics and thoroughness. Thomas Wright's cooperating physicians signed certificates they knew to be false, but from a technical standpoint their signatures were genuine. They were licensed medical practitioners, and the certificates bore all the formal hallmarks of legitimate documents. There was no mechanism for verifying that Dr. Blackwood had actually examined the body of Sarah Miller, who had allegedly died of consumption at the lodging house in Whitechapel, no way to confirm that the symptoms described had actually been observed rather than invented. The signature was sufficient, the form properly completed. The bureaucracy would accept it because rejecting it would require proof of falsification, and such proof was essentially impossible to obtain after the fact. Once the death certificate was signed, it needed to be registered with the local registrar, an official whose job was to maintain records of births, deaths, and marriages occurring in their district. The registrar would examine the certificate to ensure it was properly completed, would record the information in their register, and would issue a burial certificate that was required before a body could be interred. This step might have caught falsifications if registrars had been trained to spot them, or if they had resources to investigate suspicious cases, but in reality registrars were clerical workers processing enormous volumes of paperwork, dozens or hundreds of certificates weekly, with neither time nor inclination to question documents that appeared properly completed. Thomas had learned that registrars noticed only the most obvious discrepancies: missing signatures, unclear handwriting, forms completed in the wrong ink, or with incomplete information. They did not notice when the address given for place of death was implausible, when the age of the deceased did not quite match the other information provided, when the cause of death was recorded in vague terms that could mean almost anything. They accepted certificates at face value because questioning them would require work for which they had neither training nor time, and because the sheer volume of death in Victorian London meant that registrars were overwhelmed with legitimate cases, let alone potentially fraudulent ones. The burial certificate issued by the registrar was then presented to the cemetery authorities, who recorded it in their own registers and assigned a grave location for interment. This was another point where verification might have occurred, where cemetery clerks might have noticed that the deceased supposedly lived in Whitechapel but was being buried in Kensal Green in northwest London, a distance that poor people rarely travelled, or that the cause of death recorded on the certificate did not match the condition of the body arriving for burial. But cemetery clerks processed dozens of burials daily, maintained relationships with undertakers who brought them business, and had no incentive to create difficulties by questioning documentation that appeared legitimate. The clerks Thomas had cultivated went further than simple acceptance of questionable paperwork. They would note in cemetery registers that a body had been received from a particular undertaker on a particular date, but they were flexible about recording exact names, would accept minor variations or corrections, would enter information in ways that obscured rather than clarified identity. A body might arrive identified as Sarah Miller on the burial certificate but be recorded in the cemetery register as S. Miller or Sarah M., or even just as an unnamed female buried on such and such date. These small inconsistencies made it nearly impossible to trace specific individuals through the bureaucratic paper trail, created gaps where bodies could effectively disappear into administrative confusion. The genius of Thomas's system was that each step appeared legitimate in isolation. A doctor had signed a May certificate. A registrar had processed it and issued a burial permit. A cemetery had received the body and recorded the burial. All the paperwork existed and was technically in order. But the connections between these documents were weak, the verifications minimal, and the entire chain rested on trust that the parties involved were acting honestly. That trust was misplaced, but the system had no way of detecting the deception without specific reason to investigate a specific case, and such investigations occurred only when families raised questions or when circumstances made fraud obvious enough that it could not be ignored. Thomas had become expert at creating plausible identities for the bodies that came to him requiring discretion. The names he chose were common enough to be forgettable: Mary Smith, John Brown, Sarah Johnson, names that appeared in burial registers by the dozens that could not be distinguished from legitimate burials without additional identifying information that Thomas deliberately kept vague or omitted entirely. The ages he recorded were approximate rather than specific, allowing for discrepancies if anyone compared the body's apparent age to what was written on the certificate. The addresses were real but generic, lodging houses or tenements where dozens of people came and went and where no one would remember one more transient who had supposedly lived there briefly and died. The causes of death Thomas selected were similarly calculated. Consumption, the great killer of the Victorian era, was an all-purpose explanation that could apply to almost anyone, that covered a range of symptoms, that progressed over months or years, making it impossible to determine exactly when it had become fatal. Heart failure, apoplexy, gastric fever, dropsy. These were vague diagnoses that physicians used when they did not know or could not determine the actual cause of death. And Thomas used them for the same reason, recording causes that were common enough to be unremarkable, but general enough to prevent detailed scrutiny. He avoided causes of death that would trigger mandatory inquests or investigations. Suicide required a coroner's inquest, as did deaths from violence, suspicious deaths, deaths in custody, deaths in industrial accidents. These categories were excluded from Thomas's discretion business, not because he was morally opposed to concealing suicides or murders. He had concealed both, but because the bureaucratic requirements made concealment too risky. An inquest involved testimony from witnesses, examination of the body by a coroner's surgeon, a jury verdict that became part of official record. The opportunities for Thomas's falsifications to be exposed were too numerous to risk except in extraordinary circumstances with extraordinary fees. But most deaths did not fall into these categories, or could be made to appear as though they did not. A woman who had died from a botched abortion became a woman who had died from internal hemorrhaging due to natural causes. A man who had been murdered became a man who had died from a sudden apoplectic fit. A baby who had been smothered became a baby who had been stillborn, or who had died from unexplained infant death, which was common enough that it generated no suspicion. The transformations required understanding both medical terminology and social expectations, knowing what deaths were plausible given the deceased's supposed social position and living circumstances. The paperwork game also required managing the physical documents themselves, ensuring that certificates and permits moved through the system without leaving connections that might later prove incriminating. Thomas never kept copies of the falsified documents he generated. He had the originals prepared, used them for their intended bureaucratic purposes, and then allowed them to disappear into the vast filing systems of registrars and cemetery offices, where they would be stored alongside thousands of other documents, retrievable only if someone knew exactly what they were looking for and had specific reason to search for it. He did maintain one record, a small notebook that he kept hidden in his office, that contained coded entries for each discretion case he handled. The codes were meaningless to anyone except Thomas, initials, dates, numbers that indicated fees paid. The notebook would not have served as evidence in any legal proceeding because its contents were interpretable only by Thomas himself, but it allowed him to keep track of his business, to ensure clients had paid fully, to remember details of cases in case questions arose later. The notebook was Thomas's only concession to record keeping, and he sometimes considered destroying it, worried that its discovery would be dangerous even though its coded contents were probably indecipherable to others. The fees Thomas charged for the discretion business were substantial but variable, depending on the complexity of the case, the social position of the client, and the level of risk involved. Simple cases, a servant girl dead from an abortion, an infant that needed to disappear, might cost £20 or £30, significant money but affordable to middle-class families who faced scandal. Complex cases, an aristocrat dead in embarrassing circumstances, a businessman whose death raised questions about financial impropriety, could cost hundreds of pounds, fees that only the wealthy could afford, but that bought the kind of comprehensive concealment that left no traces. The payment had to be in cash, always. Thomas never accepted bank drafts or promissory notes, never created financial records that would connect clients to his services. The money was counted immediately upon agreement, placed in Thomas's safe, and then gradually integrated into his legitimate business accounts in ways that made it appear to be revenue from conventional undertaking. The financial concealment was as important as the pure documentary falsification because unexplained wealth would have raised questions Thomas could not afford to answer. Some clients tried to negotiate, to plead poverty, or to promise future payment, but Thomas never relented on his fees. He understood that the service he provided was valuable precisely because it was risky, that lowering fees would not reduce the risk, but would only reduce his compensation for accepting it. Clients paid, or they found other solutions to their problems, solutions that were often more dangerous or less reliable than what Thomas offered. His reputation for effectiveness meant he could charge premium rates, and the clients who came to him understood they were paying not just for service but for certainty, for the assurance that their problems would be resolved permanently. The paperwork game had been running smoothly for years, a machine Thomas had built and maintained through careful attention to detail, through cultivation of relationships with the various authorities and clerks who processed the documents, through understanding what information would be questioned and what would be accepted without scrutiny. But as 1867 turned toward 1868, as the volume of discretion cases increased, and as Thomas's reputation spread further, he was beginning to feel the weight of the system he had created, the sense that it had grown too large, become too complex, involved too many people who might make mistakes or might turn against him if circumstances changed. The paperwork was protection, but it was also vulnerability, because every false certificate was evidence of crime, every fabricated identity was proof of conspiracy, every document Thomas had created or arranged to be created could be used against him if someone decided to look carefully at the patterns hidden in London's vast bureaucracy of death. The game had worked because no one had reason to look, but Thomas was increasingly aware that reasons could emerge, that one case going wrong could expose the entire operation, and that when that happened, the paperwork that had protected him would become the evidence that destroyed him. Chapter 5. The Network. Thomas Wright's discretion business could not have functioned without the web of complicit individuals who surrounded it. People whose silence and cooperation were purchased through regular payments and mutual vulnerability, who understood that exposure of Thomas's activities would mean exposure of their own participation in crimes that could result in imprisonment or worse. Their network had grown organically over 15 years. Each person added because they filled a specific need, because they had proven reliable, or because circumstances had made their cooperation necessary. By 1807, Thomas estimated that perhaps 20 people knew enough about his activities to be dangerous, though only a handful understood the full scope of what he did. The others knew fragments or pieces of the operation, participated in, isolated transactions without comprehending how their actions fit into the larger scheme. Dr. Edmund Blackwood remained the linchpin of the medical side. He was 53 years old in 1810, his face showing the broken veins and ruddy complexion of a heavy drinker, his hands trembling slightly when he signed certificates, though never so badly that the signatures were questioned. Blackwood had trained at Edinburgh, had once maintained a respectable practice in Bloomsbury, but gambling debts and a reputation for unreliability had driven away patients until he was left with a shabby consulting room in Holborn, where desperate people sought cheap medical care, and where Thomas Wright sought compliant certification of deaths that had not occurred as claimed. Thomas met with Blackwood monthly at a public house near King's Cross, an establishment noisy enough that their conversations could not be overheard, where they appeared to be simply two tradesmen discussing business. Thomas would provide a list of names and causes of death that might be needed in coming weeks, general categories rather than specific cases, and Blackwood would prepare blank certificates pre-signed, leaving spaces for details to be filled in later. The arrangement was efficient and reduced the need for Blackwood to be contacted immediately when cases arose, though it also meant Blackwood was signing certificates for deaths he knew nothing about, a complete abandonment of medical ethics that apparently troubled him less than Thomas might have expected. Blackwood was paid £5 per certificate, a rate that had remained constant for years, and in recent months he had been signing between 3 and 6 certificates monthly. The income sustained his drinking and kept his creditors at bay, but Thomas suspected it would not be enough indefinitely, that Blackwood would eventually demand more money, or would become careless, or would confess in some drunken moment of guilt. The doctor was a vulnerability Thomas watched carefully, though he had no good alternative if Blackwood became unusable. The other physicians in Thomas's network were more occasional participants. Dr. Aldridge and Sapuku-Serk signed certificates for cases involving patients who supposedly died in charity hospitals, adding institutional credibility to deaths that had occurred nowhere near hospitals. Dr. Morton in Westminster served wealthy clients, his credentials and social position lending authority that made his certificates less likely to be questioned. Neither man knew about the others, and Thomas kept them separate deliberately, ensuring that no single physician could comprehend the full volume of falsified certificates being generated. The cemetery clerks were essential, but also numerous enough that no single clerk was critical to the operation. Thomas worked primarily with 4 different cemeteries: Kensal Green, Highgate, Brompton, and Tower Hamlets, rotating between them to avoid creating patterns that might be noticed. At each cemetery, he had cultivated relationships with at least one clerk who would process burials with minimal scrutiny, who would accept bodies with documentation that was not quite correct, who would record information in ways that obscured rather than clarified identity. Samuel Grimes at Highgate was the most reliable, a man of 60 who had worked at the cemetery for 30 years and who supplemented his modest salary by accepting payments from various undertakers for small accommodations and oversights. Grimes asked no questions, noticed no irregularities, and recorded burials with handwriting that was barely legible, making it nearly impossible for anyone reviewing the registers to determine exactly who had been buried where. Thomas paid him £2 per burial, money that Grimes claimed was for his grandchildren, but that Thomas suspected went toward the gin bottles that accumulated in Grimes's office. The lodging house keepers were the most numerous part of the network, and also the most vulnerable to exposure because they were providing false testimony if questioned. Mrs. Headley in Whitechapel ran a decrepit building on Commercial Street where rooms were rented by the night to labourers, prostitutes and transients. She had allowed Thomas to use her establishment as a registered address for perhaps 20 deaths over the years, claiming when asked that yes, such and such person had been lodging there and had died during the night. Simple enough to believe because people did die in lodging houses regularly, and landlords rarely knew much about their temporary residents. Mrs. Headley received £5 for each death supposedly occurring at her establishment, payment that was generous given she was providing nothing beyond a false statement if questioned. But she had never been questioned thoroughly, had never faced a sceptical coroner or detective who pressed for details she could not provide. Thomas worried that if she ever did face serious interrogation, she would break immediately, would confess that the deaths had not actually occurred in her building, would provide Thomas's name as the person who had paid her to lie. Mr. Parsons in Southwark and Mrs. Jenkins in Bethnal Green served similar functions at their respective establishments, providing false registered addresses for deaths that needed to appear to have occurred somewhere other than where they actually had. Thomas rotated between these lodging houses, never using any single location so frequently that patterns would emerge. But collectively they had been used dozens of times, creating dozens of opportunities for exposure if anyone examined the records carefully enough to notice that implausibly many people died at these specific addresses. Webb, the assistant, remained the person Thomas trusted most completely, though trust was perhaps the wrong word. Webb was reliable, certainly. He appeared when summoned, carried out instructions without question, maintained absolute silence about what he witnessed. But Thomas did not know what Webb thought about the work they did together, whether Webb had a moral framework that allowed him to participate without guilt or whether he simply did not care, was operating from purely mercenary motives without the burden of conscience that sometimes troubled Thomas in moments of unwelcome reflection. Webb was 41 years old, had worked for Thomas for 7 years, and in all that time had spoken perhaps a few hundred words total, most of them brief acknowledgements of instructions or simple questions about logistics. He lived alone in rooms near the Clerkenwell establishment, had no family that Thomas knew of, spent his wages on simple food and rent, and apparently nothing else. He was a cipher, blank presence who moved through the discretion business like a shadow, essential but unknowable. Thomas paid Webb £2 weekly plus additional payments for particular jobs, compensation that made Webb one of the better paid labourers in London. The money bought loyalty, or at least bought continued service, though Thomas increasingly wondered whether money would be enough if circumstances changed. If Webb were offered immunity in exchange for testimony, if the assistant's silence could be relied upon under pressure. The network extended beyond these core participants to include various occasional contributors. The constable in Whitechapel who could be paid to lose interest in suspicious deaths if they occurred in his district. The coroner's assistant who would sometimes delay inquests or provide advance warning if particular cases were going to receive scrutiny. The clerk at the General Register Office who could be convinced to misfile documents or to fail to notice irregularities if the occasion required such failures. These peripheral participants were more dangerous than the core network because Thomas had less control over them, because they were not dependent on his business for a regular income, because their cooperation was transactional rather than sustained by ongoing relationship. But they were also necessary for managing complications when they arose, for intervening when cases threatened to attract unwanted attention, for creating the breathing room Thomas needed to transform problems into routine mortality. The total monthly cost of maintaining the network was substantial. Thomas calculated that he paid perhaps £40 to £50 monthly in regular payments to the various doctors, clerks and lodging house keepers, plus additional amounts for particular cases. The payments were managed carefully, distributed in ways that did not create obvious patterns, handed over in cash during meetings that appeared casual, recorded in Thomas's coded notebook but nowhere else. The network represented both protection and vulnerability. Each person in it had incentive to maintain silence because they were implicated in the crimes Thomas committed, because exposure would mean consequences for them as well. But each person was also a potential weak point, someone who might confess if threatened, who might betray Thomas to save themselves, who might simply make mistakes that would unravel the entire operation. Thomas had long been aware that the network's size was approaching the limit of manageability. 20 people was perhaps 15 too many for a conspiracy that depended on absolute secrecy, but reducing the network was impossible without creating other risks. Cutting off payments to people who knew dangerous information would motivate them to find other ways to profit from that knowledge, through blackmail or through selling information to authorities. The people Thomas had brought into his operation could not simply be released from it. They were bound to him and he to them, a mutual entrapment that could only end badly for everyone involved if it ended at all. In early 1868, Thomas had begun to sense that the network was becoming unstable. Small things, mostly. Blackwood had been more drunk than usual at their last meeting, had been careless about keeping the pre-signed certificates concealed, had spoken too loudly about matters that should have been whispered. Grimes at Highgate had mentioned he was being questioned by cemetery management about irregularities in the burial records. Nothing serious yet, but enough to make him nervous and to make him suggest to Thomas that his payments should increase to compensate for increased risk. Most troubling was Webb. The assistant had always been silent, but lately his silence felt different, weighted with something Thomas could not identify. Webb watched him more than he used to, his eyes following Thomas during their work together in ways that felt like evaluation rather than simple attention. Webb had seen everything, had participated in every aspect of the discretion business, had carried bodies and switched clothing and helped stage scenes. If Webb ever decided to talk, Thomas would have no defense, no way to deny what dozens of cases over 7 years had established beyond any doubt. Thomas sometimes considered simply ending the discretion business, refusing new cases, allowing the network to dissolve gradually through neglect. He had accumulated sufficient savings to live comfortably on income from conventional undertaking alone. But stopping seemed as dangerous as continuing. The clients who had paid for discretion expected that discretion to be permanent. Some of them were powerful enough to be dangerous if they felt Thomas's retirement threatened their secrets, and the network itself might react badly to being cut off, might decide that Thomas had become more valuable dead than alive, that permanent silence was more reliable than continued payoffs. So the business continued, the network persisted, and Thomas managed each case with increasing care, watching for signs that the operation was coming apart, preparing himself for the moment when something would break and the entire structure would collapse, taking him down with it into sandal and prosecution and imprisonment. The network that had made him prosperous was becoming his cage, and he could see no way out that did not end in disaster. Chapter 6. The Bodies. The bodies themselves told stories that Thomas Wright worked carefully to erase, to obscure, to replace with narratives that were simpler and safer and that protected the living at the expense of truth about the dead. Each corpse that came to him requiring discretion arrived with circumstances that needed to be concealed, details that would have raised questions if acknowledged, evidence that Thomas's job was to eliminate before the body moved through the official process of certification and burial. Over 15 years he had handled perhaps 200 such cases, though he had long since stopped counting precisely, had learned that remembering too clearly was its own burden, that some knowledge was better left vague. The women were most common, representing perhaps 2/3 of the discretion cases. They died from abortions, from violence, from suicides that families needed rewritten as accidents, from circumstances that combined vulnerability and misfortune in ways that Victorian society preferred not to acknowledge. The abortion deaths were particularly frequent, reflecting the reality that unwanted pregnancy was common and safe abortion was impossible, that women with money could access marginally safer procedures while women without money risked their lives with folk remedies or the services of untrained practitioners who operated in back rooms with unsterilized instruments. Thomas had handled perhaps 50 abortion deaths over the years. The bodies arrived at his establishment in various conditions, some freshly dead, others having been held for a day or two by families trying to decide what to do, a few already beginning to decompose in ways that complicated the work of preparing them for burial. The cause of death was typically hemorrhage or infection, preventable if medical care had been available, but invariably fatal once complications set in. The women ranged from teenagers to women in their 40s, from servants to shopgirls to occasionally middle-class women whose families had money, but whose pregnancies could not be acknowledged. Thomas transformed these deaths into consumption, into peritonitis, into sudden heart failure, into any natural cause that could plausibly affect young women, and that would not trigger investigation. The bodies would be dressed in simple clothing appropriate to whatever false identity Thomas constructed, would be washed clean of blood and evidence, would be made presentable for the perfunctory viewing that might occur before burial. The abortion instruments, if they had accompanied the body, would be disposed of carefully, broken apart and scattered in the Thames, or buried in different locations where they could never be connected to each other or to the deceased. The violence deaths were less common but more disturbing. Women beaten to death by husbands or lovers, their injuries obvious, their deaths clearly not natural but transformed through Thomas's intervention into accidents or sudden illnesses. He had handled perhaps 20 such cases, each one requiring careful work to conceal evidence of violence, to position bodies in ways that hid bruising or wounds, to construct narratives that explained away what could not be hidden. One case from 1806 remained vivid in Thomas's memory despite his preference for forgetting. A young woman of perhaps 25, brought to him in the early morning by two men who had not identified themselves, who had paid in advance and in cash, who had left immediately after delivering the body and providing minimal information. The woman had been beaten severely, her face swollen and discoloured, her ribs broken, her body showing injuries that could only have resulted from sustained violence. She had died from internal injuries, from bleeding that had accumulated in her abdomen, until shock and organ failure ended her life. Thomas had examined the body with growing unease, recognising that this was not a death that could be easily explained as anything other than murder. But the men who had delivered her had paid extraordinary money, £200, enough that Thomas had been willing to attempt the transformation despite the difficulty. He had dressed her in working-class clothing, had positioned her body to hide the worst injuries, had obtained a certificate from Blackwood, recording death from internal rupture due to a fall downstairs, a cause that was just plausible enough given the injuries to satisfy anyone who did not look too carefully. The woman had been buried in Tower Hamlets Cemetery under the name Jane Williams, age listed as 30, residence listed as a lodging house in Stepney, where Mrs. Headley's equivalent had confirmed she had supposedly been staying. The burial had been witnessed by no one, the grave location recorded vaguely in the cemetery register, the woman's actual identity remaining unknown to Thomas, and presumably remaining forever unknown to anyone. She had simply disappeared into London's vast infrastructure of death. Another body in the ground, another false name in the registers, another murder concealed, and a killer freed to potentially kill again. The infant deaths were their own category of horror. Babies and young children whose deaths needed to be hidden because they had been illegitimate, because they represented scandals that could not be acknowledged, because they had died from neglect or violence that families or institutions needed to conceal. Thomas had handled perhaps 30 such cases, though the exact number was unclear, because some had been so recent, stillbirths or deaths within days of birth, that they barely registered as distinct individuals in his memory. Some of the babies had likely died, naturally victims of the high infant mortality that affected all classes, but particularly affected children born in difficult circumstances to mothers who were stressed and malnourished and unable to access medical care. Others had clearly died from neglect, their tiny bodies showing evidence of starvation, of dehydration, of simply having been left to die when they proved inconvenient. And a few showed signs of deliberate violence, smothering or drowning, or injuries that could not have been accidental. Thomas tried not to think about the babies, tried to process them as simply smaller bodies requiring the same technical approach as adult cases, but they troubled him in ways the adult deaths did not, perhaps because babies were entirely innocent, had made no choices that contributed to their fates, had simply been born unwanted, and then disposed of when their existence became problematic. He told himself that he was not responsible for their deaths, that they had died before coming to him, that his role was clean-up rather than cause. But the rationalization felt hollow even as he repeated it to himself. The suicide cases were simpler emotionally, but more complex logistically. Families desperately wanted suicides rewritten as accidents or natural deaths, because suicide carried legal penalties including forfeiture of property and denial of church burial, and because the social stigma of suicide attached to surviving family members in ways that could be devastating. But suicides often involved methods that were difficult to explain away, hangings, drownings, self-inflicted wounds that clearly could not have been accidental. Thomas had handled perhaps 20 suicides, each one requiring creative reconstruction. A man who had hanged himself became a man who had suffered a fatal apoplectic fit while standing, who who had collapsed in ways that entangled him with rope that happened to be present. A woman who had drowned herself in the Thames became a woman who had fallen from a bridge during fog, an accident rather than a deliberate act. A young man who had cut his own throat became a victim of a tragic shaving accident. Implausible, but just plausible enough that a compliant doctor would sign the certificate and a coroner would decline to inquire further. The elderly deaths were most straightforward because old age had provided cover for almost any manner of dying. An elderly person could plausibly die from heart failure, from stroke, from general debility, from dozens of conditions that required no explanation beyond advanced age. Thomas had used elderly deaths to conceal younger people whose actual ages were inconvenient, aging them on paper to make their deaths seem unremarkable. A 30-year-old woman dead from violence became a 50-year-old woman dead from heart disease, the transformation accomplished through paperwork and through careful management of who saw the body and under what circumstances. The bodies taught Thomas things about death that he'd not known when he started the discretion business, practical knowledge about decomposition and rigor mortis and lividity, about how long bodies could be held before burial became urgent, about which injuries could be concealed and which could not. He had learned that most people, even doctors, did not look carefully at bodies, that superficial presentation mattered more than detailed examination, that appearance of propriety was sufficient to prevent questions in most circumstances. He had also learned that bodies revealed truths that living people could conceal, that the physical evidence of how someone died was difficult to entirely erase even with effort and skill. Strangulation left marks on the neck that cosmetics could not completely hide. Poisoning produced discoloration and odours that careful preparation could minimize but not eliminate. Violence left patterns of injury that told stories about what had happened, even when those stories had been officially replaced with comfortable lies. In quiet moments, usually late at night when sleep would not come, Thomas sometimes thought about the bodies, about the accumulated weight of 200 deaths that he had falsified, 200 people whose actual stories had been erased and replaced with convenient fictions. He thought about how many murders he'd concealed, how many killers he had freed to potentially kill again, how many families he had helped escape consequences for crimes that should have been prosecuted. The weight of this knowledge was growing heavier as he aged, as the number of bodies increased, as the moral compromises he had made early in his career accumulated into something that felt less like practical business decisions and more like complicity and systemic injustice. But then morning would come, and another knock would sound at his door, and another client would arrive with another problem, and Thomas would put aside his misgivings and do what he had always done, transforming inconvenient death into manageable mortality. One body at a time, one falsified certificate at a time, one burial under a false name at a time. The work continuing because he had become too entangled in it to stop, too compromised to walk away, too afraid of what might happen if he refused the next case and the next. The bodies accumulated in cemeteries across London, their locations recorded vaguely if at all, their actual identities known only to Thomas and to whatever gods or forces concerned themselves with such things. They lay beneath false names and false causes of death, their stories erased, their truths buried with them, their deaths serving purposes that had nothing to do with honouring them, or mourning them, or acknowledging that they had lived and suffered and died in circumstances that deserved truth if not justice. Chapter 7. The Assistant's Conscience. Webb had never been a talkative man, but his silence had always seemed like simple taciturnity, the natural reserve of someone who preferred action to words, who did his work competently and who had no need for conversation beyond what was necessary to accomplish tasks. But in the early months of 1868, his silence felt different to Thomas Wright, weighted with something that might have been judgment or might have been knowledge, seeking expression, a pressure building behind the impassive exterior that Webb had maintained for 7 years. Thomas had hired Webb in 1861 at a time when the discretion business was expanding beyond what Thomas could manage alone, when carrying bodies and transporting them through London streets required strength and stamina that Thomas at 36 no longer possessed in sufficient measure. Webb had appeared in response to a notice Thomas had posted seeking a labourer for undertaking work, had presented himself as capable and strong and unconcerned about working with the dead, qualities that Thomas valued highly. The interview had been brief. Webb had demonstrated he could lift a full coffin easily, had shown no squeamishness when Thomas described the work, had asked only about wages and hours, and had accepted Thomas's offer without negotiation. Thomas had not inquired deeply into Webb's background. had not asked about previous employment or why a man of apparent capability was seeking work as an undertaker's assistant, a position that paid modestly and that most men avoided if other options existed. It was enough that Webb could do the work and seemed willing to do it without complaint. For the first months, Webb had worked only on conventional undertaking business, helping to prepare bodies for burial, assisting with funerals, maintaining the premises and equipment. He had proved reliable and competent, arriving punctually, following instructions precisely, working with efficiency that suggested either natural aptitude or previous experience with similar labour. Thomas had been pleased with the hire, had felt the burden of physical work lifting as Webb took on the heavier tasks. The transition to involving Webb in the discretion business had occurred gradually. The first case had been simple, a servant girl dead from an abortion, requiring transport from a house in Bloomsbury to Thomas's establishment in the middle of the night. Thomas had needed help carrying the body down narrow stairs and had asked Webb, who had assisted without question or visible reaction. When they returned to the establishment and Thomas had explained that the girl would be buried under a different name than she had lived under, Webb had simply nodded and had proceeded to help prepare the body as though this were entirely routine. Over the following weeks and months, Thomas had involved Webb in progressively more complex cases, watching carefully for signs of discomfort or moral objection, ready to compensate Webb more generously if conscience needed to be purchased. But Webb had shown no reaction, had participated in switching identities and concealing evidence, of violence and transporting bodies to locations where false registrations could be obtained, all with the same impassive competence he brought to conventional undertaking work. Thomas had been relieved and then had grown dependent on Webb's participation. The discretion business could not function without someone to handle the physical work, to be present during the transformation of bodies from their actual identities to their false ones, to drive the cart through night streets to lodging houses and cemeteries, to lift and carry and position bodies in ways that concealed inconvenient truths. Webb had become essential, and Thomas had compensated him accordingly, raising his wages significantly, providing bonuses for difficult cases, ensuring that Webb had strong financial motivation to continue his silence and his cooperation. But Thomas had never known what Webb thought about the work they did together. The assistant's face revealed nothing. His few words were only practical acknowledgements or questions, and his personal life remained entirely opaque. Thomas knew that Webb lived alone in the rooms a short walk from the establishment, that he had no family Thomas had ever met, that he spent his free time in ways that left no impression on neighbours or acquaintances who might have reported back. Webb arrived for work, did what was required, collected his wages, and departed, a closed circuit that provided no insight into his interior life. The change, subtle at first, had begun around Christmas 1807. Thomas had noticed that Webb was watching him more than usual, that the assistant's eyes followed him during their work in ways that felt like scrutiny rather than simple attention. Webb had always been observant. The work required it, but this was different, a quality of assessment that made Thomas uncomfortable, though he could not articulate exactly why. Then, in late January 1868, something had occurred that brought Webb's internal state closer to the surface. They had been handling a case involving a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, who had died from injuries sustained during a violent assault. The body had been delivered by the woman's employer, a wealthy merchant who had paid handsomely to ensure the death would not be connected to his household, who had been visibly nervous, but also coldly practical in his instructions about how the matter should be managed. Thomas and Webb had been preparing the body in the workroom, dressing it in clean clothing, arranging it to conceal the worst injuries, readying it for the falsified certification that would record death from entirely different causes. Thomas had been focused on the work, explaining to Webb how the body needed to be positioned for the doctor's examination, when he had noticed that Webb had stopped working and was simply standing, looking at the woman's face with an expression Thomas had never seen before on the usually impassive features. Webb, Thomas had said, uncertain whether something was wrong with the body or with his assistant. Webb had looked up slowly, his eyes meeting Thomas's with directness that was unusual, and had spoken words that Thomas would remember with uncomfortable clarity for the rest of his life. "She's the third one from that house." Thomas had felt a chill despite the warmth of the workroom. He had handled 2 previous cases from the same merchant, both young women, both dead in circumstances requiring discretion. He had not made the connection explicitly, had not allowed himself to recognize the pattern, had told himself that each case was isolated, that he was not responsible for what happened before the bodies arrived at his establishment. But Webb had noticed, had been counting, had recognized what Thomas had deliberately avoided seeing. "The work requires us to ask no questions," Thomas had said finally, his voice more defensive than he had intended. "We manage what we're given. The deaths occurred before our involvement." Webb had not replied immediately, had simply returned to the work of positioning the body, his movements mechanical. But after a moment he had spoken again, his voice low. "How many, do you reckon? How many has it been over the years?" The question had hung in the air between them, unanswerable, not because Thomas did not know, he knew approximately, had the number in his coded notebook, but because answering would require acknowledging what the work actually was, would force into words what both men had been avoiding through Webb's silence and Thomas's rationalizations. "We're undertakers," Thomas had said, hearing the weakness in his own justification even as he spoke it. "We manage death. The circumstances of death are not our concern." "Aren't they, though?" Webb had said, not quite a question, and then had finished the work without speaking again, leaving Thomas disturbed in ways he could not quite articulate. In the weeks since that conversation, Webb's silence had felt different, charged with the awareness that had briefly surfaced and then been pushed back below the surface but had not disappeared. Thomas found himself watching Webb as Webb watched him, both men now observing each other with caution that had not existed before, the implicit understanding that had governed their working relationship for 7 years, now complicated by acknowledged knowledge of what they were actually doing. Thomas considered whether he should address the matter directly, should offer Webb more money, or should release him from service, or should simply pretend the conversation had never occurred. But each option seemed dangerous in its own way. More money might make Webb feel he was being bribed into silence, might offend whatever code the man operated under. Releasing him would mean losing the one person Thomas trusted to handle the physical work, and would create the risk that Webb would feel betrayed and would talk to authorities or would attempt blackmail, and pretending seemed impossible now that the words had been spoken, now that both men knew explicitly what they had previously known only implicitly. The question that troubled Thomas most was what Webb would do with his conscience, if that was what was troubling him. Would he continue working, continue his silence, continue accepting wages in exchange for participation in what he now openly recognized as the concealment of crimes? Or would he reach some threshold where conscience overcame self-interest, where the accumulated weight of falsified deaths became unbearable, where he would feel compelled to confess to authorities regardless of the consequences for himself? Thomas had heard of such cases, of accomplices who turned informant, who sought absolution through betrayal of those they had worked with. The authorities offered leniency to those who provided evidence against others, offered reduced sentences, or sometimes immunity in exchange for testimony that could be used to convict more significant targets. Webb could almost certainly secure such an arrangement if he approached the police with what he knew, could probably avoid serious punishment for his own participation by presenting himself as a subordinate who had been coerced or misled by his employer. The thought kept Thomas awake at night, imagining the knock on his door that would bring police rather than clients, imagining Webb standing in a courtroom describing the cases they had handled together, the bodies they had moved and transformed and buried under false names. The testimony would be devastating precisely because it would be truthful, because Webb had witnessed everything and could provide details that would be impossible for Thomas to deny or explain away. But weeks passed and nothing happened. Webb continued to arrive for work, continued to perform his duties with the same competence he had always shown, continued to maintain his silence during their work together. The only change was in his eyes, in the way he watched Thomas, in the sense that he was now consciously choosing silence rather than simply maintaining it as default behavior. The choice made his silence more valuable but also more precarious, because what was chosen could be unchosen if circumstances changed, or if Webb's internal calculus shifted. Thomas increased Webb's wages again to £3 weekly, a sum that was generous to the point of provoking questions if anyone noticed. He also began treating Webb with more deference, asking rather than instructing, thanking him explicitly for his work, attempting to create a relationship that was more partnership than employment. But the efforts felt transparent even as Thomas made them, obvious attempts to purchase loyalty that could not really be purchased, to secure silence that was ultimately secured only by Webb's own decisions about what he could live with and what he could not. The relationship had become a form of mutual hostage-taking. Webb could destroy Thomas through testimony, but doing so would mean destroying himself as well, admitting to years of participation in crimes that no court would view as merely following orders. Thomas could potentially silence Webb permanently, could arrange an accident, or could simply kill the man himself, but such action would eliminate the one person whose assistance was necessary for continuing the discretion business and would create its own risks of exposure if the death appeared suspicious. They were bound together by mutual vulnerability and mutual guilt, neither able to escape without bringing down the other, both trapped in a situation that could only continue until something broke or until external forces intervened. Thomas did not know which outcome was more likely or which would be worse. He only sees that the assistant's conscience, once dormant or suppressed, was now active and present, and that Webb's continued silence was a courtesy that might be withdrawn at any moment, for reasons Thomas might never understand until it was too late to prevent the consequences. Chapter 8. The Investigation. The case that would threaten to unravel Thomas Wright's entire operation began unremarkably. With a knock at his door on a March evening in 1868, a well-dressed man requesting discretion regarding a death that had occurred in unfortunate circumstances. The man identified himself as Mr. Horace Pemberton, a solicitor representing a family of considerable standing whose daughter had died unexpectedly. The family wished to avoid public inquiry into the circumstances, which involved matters of a delicate nature that Pemberton declined to specify in detail. The fee offered was substantial, £100, and the request seemed routine by the standards of Thomas's discretion business. Thomas agreed to handle the matter, following his usual procedures. He and Webb collected the body from a townhouse in Belgravia in the early morning hours, a young woman of perhaps 19, well-dressed, showing no obvious signs of violence, but clearly not having died from any natural cause that Thomas could immediately identify. Pemberton had provided minimal information, saying only that the death had been sudden, that the family was distraught, and that discretion was paramount. Thomas had asked no further questions, as was his practice. He had transported the body to his establishment, had examined it more carefully into private, and had determined that the young woman had likely died from poison, probably laudanum or some similar opiate, whether administered deliberately or accidentally. He could not determine and did not particularly care to speculate about. His job was transformation, not investigation. He had obtained a certificate from Dr. Blackwood, recording death from heart failure, a conveniently vague cause that could apply to almost any sudden death. He had registered the death under the name Sarah Mitchell, listing her as a seamstress residing at Mrs. Headley's lodging house in Whitechapel, an address that placed her far from the Belgravia townhouse where she had actually died. He had arranged burial at Brompton Cemetery in a common grave that would be unmarked and untraceable. The entire process had taken 3 days and had appeared to proceed smoothly, just another case in the long sequence of falsified deaths that Thomas had managed over 15 years. But this case was different in ways Thomas would not understand until it was too late. The young woman was Margaret Ashford, daughter of Edmund Ashford, a prominent merchant banker with connections to government ministers and considerable influence in the city. Margaret had not simply died, she had disappeared 3 weeks before her death, had left her family's home without explanation, and her absence had generated extensive effort to locate her, including inquiries to police and private investigators hired by the family to search for her. When Margaret's body had been delivered to Thomas, the family had not yet abandoned hope of finding her alive. The body Thomas had buried under the name Sarah Mitchell was not the body the family had asked him to handle. It was a different young woman, delivered by Pemberton as part of a scheme to provide the Ashford family with closure, to allow them to believe Margaret had been found dead so they would stop searching and asking questions that were proving inconvenient for people who had actually been responsible for Margaret's disappearance. Thomas had been used, though he did not know it, as an instrument in a deception that extended beyond simple concealment of death into active fraud. And the deception had begun to unravel almost immediately after the burial, when the real Margaret Ashford had been found alive in France, where she had fled with a lover, very much not dead, very much able to contradict the story that her family had been told about her death and burial. The Ashford family, realizing they had been deceived, had demanded answers from Pemberton, who had disappeared. They had approached the police with information about a body that had supposedly been their daughter, buried under a false name, handled by an undertaker who had falsified documentation. And the police, presented with evidence of fraud in a case involving a prominent family, had begun an investigation that would eventually lead them to Thomas Wright's establishment in Clerkenwell. The first indication Thomas had that something was wrong came not from police, but from Webb, who arrived at the establishment one morning looking more disturbed than Thomas had ever seen him. Webb had been approached the previous evening by a man asking questions about bodies handled by Thomas's business, about procedures for death certification and burial, questions that were casual on their surface but that Webb had recognised as investigative. The man had not identified himself as police, but Webb had seen enough constables in his life to recognise one regardless of whether they were in uniform. Thomas had felt cold dread settling into his stomach. He had asked Webb what questions had been asked, what information had been provided. Webb had been characteristically taciturn, had said only that he had claimed to know nothing beyond his role as a labourer who carried coffins and dug graves, that he had referred all questions to Thomas as the proprietor who handled all business arrangements. But the fact that questions were being asked at all meant that someone was investigating. An investigation was precisely what Thomas's entire operation was designed to avoid. Over the following days, more indicators appeared that something was seriously wrong. Dr. Blackwood sent an urgent message requesting a meeting, and when they met he was visibly nervous, explaining that he had been questioned about certificates he had signed, about his examination procedures, about specific cases that the questioner seemed to know about in detail, that should not have been available to anyone outside the small circle of people involved in the discretion business. Blackwood had deflected the questions as best he could, had claimed his records were in order, but he had clearly been frightened by the encounter and had told Thomas he would not be signing any more certificates until the matter was resolved. Mrs. Headley sent word that police had visited her lodging house, asking about deaths that had supposedly occurred there, asking for descriptions of lodgers who had died, asking questions that she had attempted to answer but that had exposed inconsistencies in her previous statements. She had not explicitly confessed to providing false addresses for deaths, but she had been flustered enough that the police had clearly recognised she was hiding something. Thomas realised with growing alarm that the investigation was not focused on a single case, but appeared to encompass multiple cases, that somehow authorities had begun connecting deaths that should have appeared unrelated, that the pattern of falsification he had worked so carefully to conceal was becoming visible to people who had reason to look for it. He did not yet know the specifics of what had triggered the investigation, did not know about Margaret Ashford or about Pemberton's fraud, knew only that his operation was being scrutinised in ways that could expose everything. He considered his options, none of them good. He could cooperate with any investigation, could attempt to present his work as having been conducted in good faith, could claim he had been deceived by clients about the circumstances of deaths he had handled. But this defence would require admitting to falsification while claiming innocence of knowledge about what he was falsifying, a position that would not survive scrutiny given the volume of cases and the systematic nature of the deception. He could flee, could take the money he had saved and attempt to leave London, perhaps leave England entirely, but flight would be admission of guilt, would confirm whatever suspicions investigators held and would likely prove futile given that his name and business were well documented, that he had no experience evading authorities, that he would be easily found if police decided to pursue him seriously. He could destroy evidence, could burn his coded notebook and any other documentation that connected him to specific cases. But the evidence was distributed across multiple locations and multiple people, existed in cemetery registers and death certificates, and the memories of everyone in his network. Destroying his own records would accomplish little when so much evidence existed beyond his control. Or he could simply continue as though nothing were wrong, could maintain his routine, could handle any official inquiries with the same deflection and misdirection he had used for years, could hope that the investigation would prove unable to assemble sufficient evidence to prosecute him. But this required believing that the discretion business's protections would hold under focused scrutiny, and Thomas's confidence in those protections was evaporating as he learned more about the investigation's scope and scope. The formal police visit came on a morning in early April. 2 detectives from Scotland Yard, introduced as Inspector Davies and Sergeant Morrison, presented themselves at Thomas's establishment with questions about his business practices. They were polite but firm, making clear this was an official investigation, that Thomas was not under arrest but was expected to cooperate, that failure to answer questions could be interpreted as consciousness of guilt. Thomas had invited them into his office, had maintained composure despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm him, had answered their initial questions with careful honesty about his conventional undertaking work. Yes, he maintained relationships with several doctors who provided death certification. Yes, he worked with multiple cemeteries. Yes, he occasionally handled burials for people who had no family to make arrangements, who were referred to him by various sources. All of this was true and legal and unremarkable. But then the questions became more specific. Inspector Davies produced a list of names, asking whether Thomas had handled burials for these individuals. Thomas recognized several names from the list as false identities he had created, bodies buried under fabricated names in his discretion cases. He could not simply deny knowledge without risking that cemetery records would contradict him, could not acknowledge the names without opening himself to questions about how he had come to handle these cases and whether the documentation had been accurate. He had deflected as best he could, claiming his records would need to be consulted, claiming his memory was imperfect given the volume of burials he handled annually, promising to provide information if given time to review his files. Inspector Davies had accepted. This, with skepticism visible on his face, had said they would return in 2 days for the information Thomas had promised to compile. After the detectives left, Thomas had sat in his office feeling the walls closing in, understanding that he had perhaps 2 days to decide how to respond to an investigation that was clearly more extensive and better informed than he had initially feared. The list of names suggested someone had been examining burial records systematically, had been identifying cases where documentation appeared questionable, had been building a case that connected multiple falsified deaths to Thomas's establishment. He called for Webb, needing to discuss what information might be safe to provide to police, needing to coordinate their responses to ensure they would not contradict each other if both were questioned separately. But when Webb arrived, Thomas saw immediately that something had changed. The assistant's face showed a resolution that had not been there before, a settled quality that suggested decisions had been made. "I've been thinking," Webb said, before Thomas could speak, his voice steady, "about the work we've done, about what it means, about what happens next." Thomas felt ice in his chest. "Webb, we need to discuss how to handle the police inquiry. If we coordinate our statements—" "I'm done coordinating," Webb interrupted, the first time in 7 years he had ever interrupted Thomas. "I'm done with all of it. The lies, the bodies, the whole bloody business. I'm going to tell them the truth." The room seemed to tilt. Thomas gripped the edge of his desk, fighting to maintain composure. "You understand what that means. For both of us, you're as implicated as I am." "I know," Webb said simply, "but I can't carry it anymore. All those deaths, all those lies. I thought I could just do the work and not think about what it meant, but I can't. That girl from Belgravia, she was 19 years old, 19, and we buried her like she was nothing, like she didn't matter enough for anyone to even know her real name." "We didn't kill her," Thomas said desperately. "We didn't cause her death. We helped hide it. We helped whoever did kill her get away with it. We've done that hundreds of times." Webb shook his head slowly. "I'm going to the police tomorrow morning. I'm going to tell them everything I know. You can do what you want, but that's what I'm doing." Thomas watched his assistant, his former assistant, walk out of the office, heard his footsteps on the stairs, heard the door close with finality, and he understood that the discretion business was over, that 15 years of careful deception were about to collapse, that everything he had built and everything he had buried was about to be exposed. He sat alone in his office as afternoon turned to evening, considering options that no longer existed, understanding that Webb's testimony would provide police with everything they needed to prosecute him, that his network would collapse as each person in it sought to save themselves by providing evidence against him, that the web of falsification he had woven so carefully was about to strangle him. The investigation had found him, and there was nowhere left to hide. Chapter 9. The Price of Silence. Thomas Wright did not sleep that night. He sat in his office as darkness fell and gaslight cast shadows that seemed to move with malevolent purpose as the city around him continued its indifferent rhythms, as somewhere Webb prepared to destroy everything Thomas had built and everything Thomas was. The coded notebook lay on the desk before him, 200 cases reduced to initials and dates and numbers, evidence that would be incomprehensible to anyone except Thomas, but that would be damning simply by existing, by demonstrating systematic record-keeping of activities that should have left no records at all. He should burn it, should destroy the one piece of physical evidence that connected him directly to the full scope of his operations. But he found himself unable to move, paralyzed by the recognition that burning the notebook would change nothing, that the evidence existed in too many other forms, in too many other minds, to be eliminated by destroying one ledger. He thought about the clients who had paid for his discretion, the wealthy families and prominent individuals whose secrets he had protected for years. They would abandon him now, would deny ever having sought his services, would claim they had been deceived if their connections to him were exposed. The very quality that had made him valuable to them, his knowledge of their crimes and indiscretions, now made him dangerous, someone who needed to be distanced from, someone whose destruction they might actively facilitate if it protected them from association with him. Some of those clients were powerful enough to be genuinely dangerous. The aristocrats whose family scandals he had concealed, the businessmen whose criminal negligence he had helped obscure, the government officials whose moral failings he had buried along with the evidence of those failings. If Thomas went to trial, if he attempted to defend himself by explaining that he had merely been serving clients who had sought his services, those clients would have strong motivation to ensure he never reached a courtroom, or at least never spoke freely in one. The thought of assassination had never occurred to Thomas as a serious possibility before, but it occurred to him now with uncomfortable plausibility. An accident could be arranged easily enough. Thomas knew how easily because he had participated in arranging several such convenient accidents over the years, had helped transform murders into mishaps, had understood intellectually, if not viscerally, that the same techniques could be applied to any inconvenient person, himself included. A man alone in his establishment late at night, a fire that started in the workroom where chemicals were stored, Thomas overcome by smoke and killed in the blaze that would destroy his records and remove him as a potential witness. It would be simple, tragic, and ultimately convenient for everyone whose secrets Thomas carried. He stood and moved through the establishment, checking locks, ensuring all entrances were secured, understanding even as he did so that locked doors would provide no real protection if someone with resources decided he needed to be silenced permanently. But the action provided illusion of control, gave him something to do with the energy that terror was producing, allowed him to pretend he had options when the options had already been exhausted by Webb's decision to confess. Around midnight, Thomas made a decision of his own. If he was going to be destroyed, he would not be destroyed alone. He would not allow the clients who had profited from his services to escape consequences while he bore all the blame. He would document what he knew, would create a full accounting of every case he could remember, every client who had sought his services, every death he had falsified and why. The document would be his insurance, his guarantee that whatever happened to him, the truth would survive him, would be delivered to newspapers and authorities, would expose the corruption that had sustained his business for 15 years. He began writing, filling pages with names and dates and circumstances, pulling cases from memory and from the coded entries in his notebook, translating the abbreviations into full narratives that explained who had died and how and who had paid to conceal the truth. The writing continued through the night, his hand cramping, his eyes burning with exhaustion, but the work providing purpose that kept the paralysis at bay. He wrote about the Duke's son who had died from chloroform, about the servant girls who had died from abortions, about the merchant whose household had produced 3 dead young women, about all the cases he could remember with sufficient detail to be credible. By dawn, he had produced a document of perhaps 50 pages, a comprehensive confession and accusation combined, evidence that would destroy him, but that would also damage or destroy many of the people who had used his services. He sealed the pages in an envelope, addressed it to a journalist he knew by reputation to be interested in scandal and corruption, and hid it in a space behind a loose board in his office, a location he had prepared years earlier for documents that needed to be concealed. He wrote a brief note to be left visible on his desk, stating that if anything happened to him, if he died or disappeared, specific instructions existed for delivery of the sealed document to its intended recipient. The insurance was imperfect. If someone killed him in ways that prevented the note from being discovered, if his establishment burned with him inside it, the document would be destroyed before it could be delivered. But the note's existence and the implicit threat it represented might provide some protection, might make potential assassins hesitate, might buy time that Thomas desperately needed to determine what options remained. Morning came, grey and cold, and Thomas was still alive, still sitting in his office surrounded by the evidence of his crimes. Webb would be going to the police this morning, would be providing testimony that would trigger Thomas's arrest within hours or days. The investigation that had been cautious and methodical would become aggressive once they had a cooperating witness who could provide details about specific cases, who could testify about the procedures Thomas had used to falsify deaths and conceal evidence. Thomas considered turning himself in, going to the police before they came for him, attempting to negotiate some accommodation by cooperating immediately. But he had nothing to offer them that Webb could not provide, no evidence that would be valuable enough to trade for leniency, no testimony that would implicate others more significant than himself, because he was the central figure in the operation, the person around whom everything else had orbited. Around mid-morning, there was a knock at the door. Thomas's heart seized, certain that police had arrived to arrest him, that Webb had already provided his testimony and that consequences were beginning. But when he opened the door, he found not police but a messenger boy holding an envelope marked urgent. Thomas took the envelope, paid the boy, and returned to his office before opening it. Inside was a brief letter written in an educated hand, unsigned, offering him a choice. He could accept £10,000 and passage to America, leaving immediately, never returning to England, never speaking of his former business or his former clients. Or he could remain in London, face arrest and prosecution, and suffer whatever consequences resulted not just from the law, but from the numerous powerful people who had reason to ensure his silence became permanent. The letter specified a location where he should appear that evening if he accepted the offer, a dock warehouse in Limehouse, where arrangements would be made for his immediate departure. The letter also specified that if he spoke to police before that meeting, if he attempted any alternative to accepting the offer, the arrangement would be withdrawn and he would face consequences that the letter declined to specify, but that Thomas had no difficulty imagining. It was a bribe and a threat combined, an offer made by someone with sufficient resources to arrange his escape or to arrange his death, someone who had learned of the investigation and of Webb's impending testimony, and who was moving to prevent Thomas from cooperating with authorities in ways that might expose clients who preferred to remain concealed. Thomas did not know which client had sent the letter, whether it was someone acting on their own behalf or someone acting on behalf of multiple clients who had pooled resources to manage the Thomas Wright problem. The offer was genuine, he was certain of that. £10,000 was significant money but not ruinous for the wealthy, and it was cheaper than the scandal and potential prosecution that Thomas's testimony might generate for people who had sought his services. America was distant enough that Thomas would effectively disappear, would become someone else in a country where no one knew his history, where he could live comfortably on £10,000 for years if he was cautious. But accepting the offer meant abandoning everything, his business, his home, his identity, his country. It meant living in exile, always wondering if the people who had arranged his departure might eventually decide he was still a risk, might send someone to America to ensure his silence became permanent after sufficient time had passed that his death would not be connected to his former activities. It meant carrying his guilt and his secrets forever without possibility of confession or absolution, meant living with the knowledge that he had concealed hundreds of deaths and that the concealment would continue because he had been paid to maintain it. Refusing the offer meant facing arrest, prosecution, imprisonment, and potentially worse. It meant Webb's testimony would be corroborated by Thomas's own confession, meant many of the people whose secrets he had protected would be exposed, and meant the entire corrupt system that had sustained his business would be revealed and possibly prosecuted. It meant accepting consequences that would almost certainly include years in prison, and might include judicial execution if prosecutors decided to pursue murder charges based on his role in concealing killings. Thomas sat with the letter in his hand, watching morning turn to afternoon, understanding that he was being offered a version of the same choice he had provided to the bodies he had transformed over 15 years, accept a false identity and disappear, or remain and face the truth of what had actually occurred. The irony was not lost on him, that he was now the body requiring transformation, the problem requiring management, the inconvenient person who needed to be concealed through money and coercion and the threat of violence. He thought about Webb, about this assistant's decision to confess, about the conscience that had driven Webb to reject the comfortable complicity that Thomas still found tempting even now when everything was collapsing. Webb had chosen truth regardless of consequences, had decided that carrying the weight of concealed deaths was worse than accepting punishment for having concealed them. Thomas understood the choice intellectually, but could not make himself embrace it emotionally, could not convince himself that confession and punishment would provide relief rather than simply adding suffering to guilt. As evening approached, Thomas made his decision. He would not go to the warehouse in Limehouse. He would not accept the £10,000 and the passage to America, but neither would he turn himself in to police, would not cooperate with their investigation, would not provide testimony that would expose his clients along with himself. He would simply wait, would allow events to proceed as they would accept whatever consequences arrived without fighting them or fleeing from them. It was not courage that motivated this decision, nor was it exactly resignation. It was simply exhaustion, The recognition that 15 years of falsifying deaths had drained him of whatever capacity for decisive action he might once have possessed, had reduced him to someone who could only react to circumstances rather than shape them, who had spent so much energy concealing truth that he had none remaining to embrace it. He burned the letter offering him escape. He retrieved the document he had written during the night, the comprehensive confession that would have exposed his clients, and he burned that as well, watching the pages curl and blacken in the fireplace, the names and cases dissolving into ash, the insurance he had created revealing itself as illusion, as something he had never truly intended to use because using it would have required a decisiveness and a moral clarity he no longer possessed. The coded notebook he left on his desk, visible, available to whoever might come searching for it. Let them decode it if they could. Let the truth emerge or remain hidden as circumstances dictated. He was finished making decisions about what should be concealed and what should be revealed. He sat in his darkening office, waiting for the knock that would bring police or assassins or simply another client seeking discretion, unable at this point to predict which arrival would come first or which would be worse. The price of silence, he understood now, was everything, and he had nothing left with which to pay it. Chapter 10. The Final Collection. Thomas Wright died on the evening of November 12, 1869, 19 months after the investigation had begun, in circumstances that were recorded officially as accidental, but that raised questions never adequately answered in the brief inquest that followed his death. He had been found at the bottom of the stairs leading from his establishment to the street, his neck broken, his body positioned in ways that suggested he had fallen from the top of the stairs and had tumbled down the full flight before coming to rest at the bottom. The coroner's jury, presented with testimony from neighbours who had heard a crash and had discovered the body, with evidence that the stairs were steep and poorly lit, with Thomas's reputation as a respectable tradesman, had returned a verdict of accidental death, concluding that he had simply lost his footing in the darkness and had fallen to his unfortunate demise. But Webb, who testified at the inquest and who was questioned briefly about his former employment with Thomas, had told a different story to a journalist who interviewed him afterward, a story that never appeared in official records but that was preserved in the journalist's notes, discovered decades later in an archive of papers donated to a historical society. According to Webb's account, Thomas had not been alone in his establishment that evening. Webb had gone there himself, despite having left Thomas's employment months earlier, having been troubled by rumours he had heard about threats against his former employer, wanting to warn Thomas that people from their shared past were looking for him, that the clients whose secrets Thomas had protected had decided those secrets would be safer if Thomas were no longer alive to potentially reveal them. Webb had arrived to find Thomas in his office, looking exhausted and resigned, surrounded by papers he had been burning in the fireplace. They had spoken briefly, Thomas thanking Webb for the warning, but saying it was too late, that he had already made his choices and would accept whatever consequences resulted. Webb had urged him to go to the police, to seek protection, to confess fully and hope for mercy. Thomas had refused, had said he was too tired to run and too compromised to deserve mercy, that whatever happened would happen, and he would not resist it. Webb had left, uncomfortable with Thomas's fatalism but unable to convince him to take action. He had been walking away from the establishment, perhaps 50 yards distant when he had heard the crash, had turned back and had seen two men leaving through the front door, moving quickly, disappearing into the evening foot traffic before Webb could reach them. He had found Thomas at the bottom of the stairs, clearly dead, the body arranged in ways that suggested a fall, but that Webb believed showed signs of having been positioned after death, rather than having landed naturally. Webb had reported what he had seen to the police constables who arrived after neighbours raised the alarm, had described the two men he had glimpsed leaving, had expressed suspicion that Thomas had been murdered rather than having fallen accidentally. But his testimony had been noted and then largely ignored, classified as speculation from a disgruntled former employee, given less weight than the physical evidence that seemed consistent with accidental death. The inquest had been brief, perfunctory, concluded within days rather than the weeks or months that suspicious deaths sometimes generated. The jury had heard testimony from the doctor who examined the body, who confirmed the broken neck was consistent with a fall downstairs. They had heard from neighbours who said they had heard only a crash, no voices, no sounds of struggle. They had heard from the constables who had found no evidence of forced entry or disturbance beyond the body at the bottom of the stairs, and they had returned their verdict of accidental death, allowing Thomas Wright to be buried in Brompton, Cemetery under his own name, in a grave that would be marked and maintained, accorded the dignity and death that hundreds of bodies he had handled had been denied. The investigation into Thomas's discretion business had effectively ended with his death. Webb had already provided testimony to police about the falsified burials, the network of cooperating doctors and cemetery clerks, the systematic concealment of deaths over 15 years. But without Thomas to prosecute, without the principal actor available to stand trial, the investigation lost momentum and focus. Some members of the network were questioned, a few were charged with minor offences related to falsifying documents, but none faced serious prosecution. The clients who had paid Thomas for discretion were never identified officially, were never questioned, were never required to account for their involvement in concealing deaths. Dr. Blackwood's medical license was suspended briefly pending an investigation into his certification practices, but was then reinstated after he produced records showing he had examined the bodies he had certified, records that Thomas had carefully created and maintained precisely for such contingencies. The cemetery clerks claimed ignorance of any wrongdoing, insisted they had simply processed burials according to procedures and were not disciplined beyond stern warnings. Mrs. Headley and the other lodging house keepers who had provided false addresses were never charged, their testimony having been deemed too unreliable to warrant prosecution. The bodies remained where Thomas had buried them, in graves scattered across London's cemeteries, under false names that would never be corrected, their actual identities lost to history, their families never knowing where they actually lay, or what had actually become of them. The system Thomas had exploited continued functioning as it always had, overwhelmed and porous, processing thousands of deaths yearly, with insufficient oversight to prevent falsification by those clever enough and corrupt enough to manipulate it. Webb lived for another 40 years, working various labouring jobs, never again employed as an undertaker's assistant, carrying with him the weight of 7 years spent helping Thomas Wright conceal deaths and transform bodies into lies. He gave occasional interviews to journalists interested in crime and corruption in Victorian London, repeating his belief that Thomas had been murdered, that powerful clients had arranged his death to silence him permanently. But Webb had no proof, could provide no names of suspects, could only describe what he had seen that evening: 2 men leaving Thomas's establishment, a body positioned at the bottom of stairs in ways that seemed staged rather than accidental. The journalist's notes containing Webb's account described him as haunted, as someone who had made peace with his own culpability, but who remained troubled by the deaths that had been concealed, by the justice that had been denied to victims whose families had never learned the truth about their fates. Webb died in 1909, age 82, his funeral attended by few people, his grave in Abney Park Cemetery marked with a simple stone that recorded his name and dates and nothing else. Thomas Wright's establishment in Clerkenwell continued operating for several years after his death, sold to another undertaker who ran it as a conventional business, unaware of or uninterested in its former proprietor's discretion services. The building was eventually demolished in the 1890s, replaced by a warehouse, the location losing any physical connection to the activities that had occurred there during Thomas Wright's tenure. The coded notebook was discovered among Thomas's effects after his death, examined by police and ultimately filed away as evidence in a case that would never be fully prosecuted. The notebook remained in police archives for decades, was transferred eventually to a historical archive, and was examined periodically by researchers trying to understand Victorian crime and corruption. The codes were never entirely deciphered, the initials and numbers suggesting patterns but never yielding definitive identification of specific cases or specific clients. The notebook became a historical curiosity, evidence of systematic wrongdoing whose details remain tantalizingly obscure. The question of whether Thomas Wright was murdered or died accidentally has never been definitively answered. The evidence supporting accident is substantial: the steep stairs, the poor lighting, the lack of witnesses to any violence, the coroner's official verdict. The evidence supporting murder is purely circumstantial. Webb's glimpse of men leaving the establishment, Thomas's knowledge of dangerous secrets, the timing of his death during an investigation that threatened to expose his clients, the arranged quality of his body that Webb believed he detected, but that might have been nothing more than the former assistant's guilt-driven need to believe Thomas had not died alone and afraid at the bottom of his own stairs. What is certain is that Thomas Wright spent 15 years managing death for profit, that he concealed hundreds of deaths from official record, that he enabled crimes that would otherwise have been investigated and potentially prosecuted, and that he died with most of his secrets intact, protected in death by the same mechanisms of concealment and misdirection that had sustained his business in life. The corpse collector had become a corpse, had been collected and processed through the system he had manipulated for so long, had been buried and recorded, and officially explained in ways that may or may not have reflected the truth of what had actually occurred. The irony was obvious to anyone who knew his history, that the man who had falsified so many deaths had his own deaths certified and recorded in ways that raised questions never fully answered, that suggested official explanation might be concealing rather than revealing what had actually happened. The bodies he had buried remained in their graves, silent witnesses to crimes they could not testify about, victims whose stories had been erased and replaced with comfortable fictions. The clients he had served moved through their lives unburdened by consequences, their secrets protected by Thomas's death and by the incomplete investigation that had ended with his demise. The system that had enabled his work continued operating, was eventually reformed through regulations and oversight that closed some gaps, but never entirely eliminated the opportunities for those willing to exploit them. Victorian London's infrastructure of death, vast and overwhelmed and morally compromised, had absorbed Thomas Wright and his crimes without particular difficulty, had processed his business and his death with the same bureaucratic efficiency it applied to everything, had filed away the evidence and the questions, and moved on to managing the endless flow of mortality that characterized life in the greatest city of the greatest empire the world had ever known. The candle burns low, the page is turned. The story ends not with resolution, but with the silence of the grave, with questions unanswered and truth buried beneath comfortable lies, with justice denied and memory fading into history. And somewhere in London's cemeteries, beneath stones that bear false names or no names at all, lie the bodies that passed through Thomas Wright's hands, their stories lost, their deaths transformed into whatever narrative suited the living. Their final rest purchased not with dignity, but with the discretion of a man who understood that in Victorian London death was commerce and truth was negotiable, and some secrets were worth more than the lives they concealed. The Bedside Historian closes this chapter of history, this account of the corpse collector who managed death until death managed him, this story of Victorian London's shadow economy where bodies were transformed and truths were buried, and the price of silence was measured in coins and lives and souls. May you rest more peacefully than those whose stories we have told tonight. Until we meet again in the darkness where history waits to be remembered. Thank you for listening to the Bedside Historian. Sleep well and carry these stories gently into your dreams.